both sides.
Yeah.
So then you would get to the copy and then they can send it where. That should work, and then as long as they just hit end stream. Sounds good. That should work. Thank you. I'm like, that's such a help, just because like I used to have to bring in like a whole rack and a computer and a camera. So it was like if I was to use this would be like so much easier and it would sound better than a camera with a stick mic in the back. So thank you, I appreciate it.
No problem.
Doesn't play a little bit, yeah. Thankfully, so I think some of the focus on policy recommendations, so that helps.
Well, right where I was going to guide you,
I'm going to get everything settled.
I'll ask IT if it's.
Okay, great, yeah.
How you doing?
They are.
Has asked.
They're taking damages and junk.
Is there a microphone?
Got a preliminary injunction.
Our classroom
Against the enforcement. My personnel.
Is there a way to activate the classroom mic so that the voice?
I didn't actually say this to them. My first thought was you guys didn't see this coming. They wanted this. They've been looking for.
All right.
To.
Do anything, it will automatically.
Yeah, and I was like, you gave it to the
No, we've had some interactive hours. Yeah, they're saying it's like really good.
Pardon me, but my IT expert says that your voice will automatically be amplified through classroom microphone. So, and it causes for concern as soon as the live streaming kicks in, the automatic amplification.
Yeah, I'll ask.
All right, I'd like to introduce you to the event's co-sponsor, my colleague. Please come on. My colleague, Tony Pomodoro, is the director of the Institute of Ethics here.
Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having us.
That's great.
I don't have my.
A lot of students have class at 11:50, so usually 2 or 3 minutes.
How do you pronounce your name?
I'm on McLeod.
McLeod, okay.
Yeah, it's like that. It's like the Highlander in was it Lambert, Christopher Lambert, and everything. You could cut off his head. Remember that?
I actually, I'm sort of embarrassed to say I do. Not only do I remember it, but I've seen some pretty awful sequels to that, I think.
I was called the Highlander in law school
Was that
by
right?
one of my professors. Yeah.
Wow.
I used to tell him there can only be one.
He became the Christopher Lambert, I think he pronounced.
Lambert. Oh.
Became king of
Sean Connery is the first one.
Sean Connery is a person, isn't it? Yes, he was. He played a Spanish knight. Remember? With a Scottish accent.
Yeah, I saw a lot of them. I even saw that Beowulf that he was in. I don't know what I was doing in the 90s.
Probably watching Pulp
Not enough
Fiction.
studying. Not enough studying. Well, is there any last minute questions or anything I can help with? colleagues and the administrators come in, if you don't mind, I'd like to.
Absolutely.
I know that we have at least one dean and vice president who are.
I didn't know what I was gonna say. Or what I was gonna, I mean, I don't know. Hopefully we'll.
Yeah,
I was preparing, I was like, I wonder how much will this, like, I don't really know.
I've talked with many people about this. The way I look at it is, you and I are both going to be explaining different points of view.
That's what I was, yeah,
Personality.
right, yeah.
One of the things I look forward to in things like this is light. And, I have to admit, I'm one of those people. I'm not interested in. I'm really interested in enlightening them and each other. So.
Last month, we had our two speakers started out very different positions. And there was even some impromptu Lincoln Douglas that was unexpected. But by the end, it was, you could tell they were really friends. And after lunch, they exchanged cards, and it was really quite gratifying to see them come from these two points of view and decide to stay in contact.
What were they talking about?
They were talking about the Supreme Court's affirmative action case.
Okay.
We had the dean of the newly appointed dean for inclusive excellence at Grand Valley State University,
Okay.
and an attorney who just won election as a Republican to the Ohio House of Representatives, in opposition of affirmative action. And they came from these two poles, and very very cordial, but a little emphatic. And then by the end, there were a lot of, well, I understand your position, but, and then, I agree with you to a large extent. I just can't get all the way there. And then by the end,
He's doing great. Good, how are you? Tony, how you doing? Good to see you.
Well, I'm planning to draw up some other research, like,
I have to tell you, I'm going light on cases because
yeah, I'm going to talk about two cases.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking more about different points of view. Although I have to tell you that there's some areas at the end that I'm going to point out that are problematic from this point of view, but
President,
absolutely.
Vice President, my understanding is yours. Absolutely.
I got to take some copies.
This is Frank Rebar, Vice
Oh, no, my pleasure.
Yeah.
1900, yeah, just under that.
Yeah.
It's from college.
Which is, yeah, okay. Oh, really?
I'd be there actually.
We get a lot of that. I've never heard of it or never been here.
Thank you very much. I really do appreciate all your help.
Do you think we're doing the part? Just like every other college university.
It's time to get started.
Thank you.
So, no. He wants to go back to the seats.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Adrian College's Institute for Ethics and George Romney Institute for Law and Public Policy, welcome to today's debate titled, "Does the Constitution Require the Separation of Church and State?" Before we begin, I'd like to thank President Docking and Adrian College's senior staff for supporting our institutes in their programming. Without their support, these events could not take place. Next to me are two distinguished scholars who teach in the area of religious liberty to share their answers to today's debate question. Professor Jessica Naus graduated from Boston University and has degrees from Albany Law School, where she was valedictorian of her class, and the Yale Law School. She joined the University of Toledo College of Law in 2007 and has since distinguished herself as an influential and prolific scholar on a wide array of constitutional and civil rights issues, including marriage, gender, and sexuality. Professor Iman McLeod attended college at Amherst before earning a law degree and a PhD from the University of Michigan in political science. Professor McLeod is likewise an expert constitutional scholar widely published in his field. After years of outstanding teaching at the University of Idaho, he joined the faculty of the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law, where he teaches the First Amendment last year. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests. The format of today's discussion will be as follows. Professor Naus will share her view on whether the Constitution requires the separation of church and state for 10 minutes, followed by Professor McLeod, who will do the same. Professor Naus will then respond for 5 minutes, followed by Professor McLeod. The remainder will consist of questions for either speaker or both from the audience. I hope you will challenge these speakers with thoughtful questions that compel a stronger defense of their views. Our event will end at 12:50 p.m. If our speakers would join me on the stage, please. Professor Naus, 10 minutes, please.
So I don't go over. Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you. So thank you to Professor Gunning for organizing, to Professor McLeod for participating, to all the sponsors, and to all of you for coming. I'm glad to be here. It's my first time here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So when we think about separation of church and state, it's really all a matter of degree, how much separation is appropriate. And I'm going to argue that under the Supreme Court's current interpretation of the religion clauses, we don't have enough separation. And this causes a variety of problems, but the one I'm going to focus on is that it results in the government supporting religious entities, even when those entities are engaged in discrimination, sometimes against racial minorities, sometimes against LGBTQ people, sometimes, and often against non-adherents of their own religion. And the conservative supermajority on the court today has adopted a narrative where the religious entity is painted as the victim of discrimination rather than in any way the perpetrator of discrimination. So let me start with some background on the religion clauses to kind of frame our conversation. The First Amendment of the federal Constitution tells us that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And the first piece of that is known as the Establishment Clause. The second piece is the Free Exercise Clause. This is maybe the only place in the Constitution where two individual rights are directly balanced against each other within a single sentence. So it's a unique construction. The word religion appears only once in the text at the center of the two clauses, with the concept being that there's a balance between the two pieces, the free exercise and the establishment component. Historically, for many years until recently, the Supreme Court has said that either clause, quote, if expanded to a logical extreme, would tend to clash with the other. The justices have described the purpose of the clauses as ensuring that no religion is sponsored or favored, none commanded, that's the establishment piece, and none inhibited, and that's the free exercise piece. So from that, we can say that neither clause should be taken to the extreme, because when either one becomes too broad, the other one becomes too narrow. So if establishment gets out of control, it swallows free exercise. If free exercise gets out of control, it swallows establishment. But that's what has happened in recent years. The conservative supermajority has read the free exercise clause so broadly that the establishment clause has almost no meaning. So Justice Breyer wrote in a dissent last term Quote, the court today pays almost no attention to the words in the first clause, meaning the Establishment Clause, while giving almost exclusive attention to the words in the second, meaning the Free Exercise Clause. And Justice Sotomayor similarly wrote, also in a dissent last term, that the court has led us to a place, quote, where the separation of church and state has become a constitutional violation. And let me explain why I think that's so problematic. Beyond that, it's inconsistent with the text because no part of the Constitution should be a nullity or surplusage. So you don't want to read the Establishment Clause out of the Constitution, which I think is what has happened. This move toward an extreme version of free exercise and basically erasure of the Establishment Clause has happened in the last 5 years or so. And it was especially apparent last term. So to illustrate the shift that's happened, I want to tell you the story of two cases. One from 1971 called Lemon versus Kurtzman, so it's about 50 years ago, and one from last term called Carson versus Macon. So in Lemon, this is back in 1971, two different state governments were giving money to private schools, and some of those schools were religious schools. The schools were only supposed to get funding for the secular components of their education, but it required a lot of state oversight to make sure that the religious schools were only using the state funds for the secular pieces. And so the state funding was challenged as violating the Establishment Clause. Basically, the argument being funding these religious schools in any way is an establishment of religion. So in deciding the case, the court developed something known as the Lemon Test, which became the standard in Establishment Clause cases for the next 50-ish years. Until last term, or maybe earlier than that, but last term, the conservative justices told us that Lemon has been, quote, long since abandoned. So Lemon is no longer good law. But what Lemon required of the government, or was that government actions must have three things. They have to have a secular purpose, a secular effect, and they can't cause the government to become entangled with religion. And in Lemon, the court found the state funding of private religious schools to be unconstitutional under the third prong of that test. So they found that when the government was funding these private religious schools, it was entangling itself with religion because of all the oversight that was required to make sure the funds were being used for secular purposes. So another way of saying that is the court did not think there was enough separation of church and state in that program. And I want to talk a little bit about the story behind Lemon because it gets to some of my concerns about the current trajectory. So Mr. Lemon, the challenger of, one of the parties in the case, was a Black civil rights activist who was the parent of children who attended public school. And one of the claims that the parties made in the case, which the court didn't end up taking up this claim, so it wasn't addressed at the Supreme Court level, but was that the religious schools, almost all of which were Catholic, were racially discriminatory. And this is, again, in 1971, so this is the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education and efforts to desegregate public schools. What was happening was that white parents who wanted their children to attend segregated schools were pulling their kids from the public schools, putting them into the private religious schools, and then the state sets up this program which gives the private religious schools some money, which allows them to stay in business and basically continue discriminating, which meant that Mr. Lemon's kids could not attend an integrated public school because all of the white kids are at the discriminatory private schools. And so essentially what happened was that by funding these Catholic schools, the state was basically supporting race discrimination. But to be clear, in Lemon itself, the Supreme Court did not decide on the race discrimination grounds or anything related to that kind of race discrimination at all. They decided based on the Establishment Clause and held that the state program was unconstitutional because it, as I said, entangled the state with religion. So fast forward 50 years, and let me tell you about this case from last term called Carson versus Macon, which is really a complete reversal of the concept behind Lemon. So Carson versus Macon took place in the state of Maine, which is a very rural state. So I used to live in Maine, beautiful, lots of moose, not a lot of people. So some school districts, because it's so rural and there are not a lot of people, some school districts don't operate secondary schools because there just aren't enough kids there to make it make sense. In those districts, parents can choose a school for their kids to attend, and the state will pay that school to defray the cost of tuition. The school can be public or private, but it can't be religious. And so that seems consistent with what we said in Lemon, can't fund the religious schools. It's a little more nuanced than that, but I'm going to leave the rest to the side. In this case, in Carson versus Macon, instead of people challenging the funding of religious schools as violating the Establishment Clause, people challenged the lack of funding as violating the Free Exercise Clause. So when Maine funds some private schools, the secular ones, but not the religious ones, that, the argument went, was burdening the free exercise of religion. And the court agreed and said that when Maine decided not to fund religious schools, it was violating the Free Exercise Clause. It was burdening those schools' religious rights. So as I said, this is a complete reversal of Lemon because not only did a state funding religious schools not violate the Establishment Clause, but a state not funding religious schools violated the Free Exercise Clause if it was going to fund any other private school. So why do I think this is so problematic? I mentioned the race discrimination that Mr. Lemon argued was happening at religious schools in the 1960s and 70s. Well, today in some of the religious schools in the state of Maine, there is LGBTQ discrimination happening. Some of them have policies that deny enrollment based on gender identity and sexual orientation. And last term, the state of Maine was told by the Supreme Court that unless it funds these discriminatory religious schools, it cannot fund any private schools, or that violates the Free Exercise Clause. And Carson versus Macon is not an isolated case. So the court, I'm wrapping up, so I'm not going to go into the details of the other pieces, but the court in 2021 required the city of Philadelphia to work with the Catholic foster care agency that engaged in LGBTQ discrimination. The court this term seems poised to allow a religious website developer to discriminate against LGBTQ customers. So in this whole set of cases, what is happening is that the court is envisioning religious entities that typically represent mainstream religions in these cases as victims of discrimination, and they allow those entities to use religion as a shield against having to comply with anti-discrimination laws that are meant to actually protect historically subordinated groups. And so a big concern, I think, is that it is making those anti-discrimination laws effectively optional. So you get my time is up. I will stop there and turn things over to Professor McLeod.
You give me 1 minute. Sure. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. I think it was very interesting. I want to agree with Professor Knauss on one really important point, and that's where I'm going to start, which is that the Constitution demands that we accommodate religion and that we allow it to exist. I would completely agree that no part of the Constitution would be a nullity, and the Supreme Court has generally adopted that same point of view. So really what the Constitution does is it demands that we struggle. It demands that we struggle with various different commands. Number one, that we allow people free exercise of religion, but it doesn't really say what that means. It demands that we not establish any religion, but it doesn't tell us what it means not to establish a religion. It demands that we give people freedom of speech, but it doesn't tell us what speech is or how much speech should be allowed. It demands that we not withdraw from people the equal protection of the laws or due process of law, but it doesn't really tell us what those are. I always say in my con law classes that the U.S. Constitution is, and this is the case, and I always explain why it creates so many problems for it. One of the reasons why it creates so many problems for us is because it is the oldest Constitution that's still in effect and the shortest. A lot of people don't know this. Every state constitution in the United States is longer than the United States Constitution. And it's full of these vague phrases, like I just mentioned. Due process. What the heck is that? Freedom of speech. What is speech? What is equal protection? What does it mean not to establish? It tells us nothing. One of the things that actually, if you look at a lot of modern statutes, one of the things that's actually there is a definition section. You look at it, we don't have that in our Constitution. It doesn't define any of that, right? We are just left to struggle. And we're left with these institutions that are created for us. The Supreme Court, the states, the Congress, the presidency. We're just left with those things in order to guide our struggle, to be the venues for our struggle, to figure out what the heck this document that so many of us revere is telling us to do. I'm here to just present the argument about the fact that we are meant to struggle with it, that we're meant that we are supposed to try to figure out how to live with this thing called religion. What is it? That's one of the things, and that's one of the things I want to point out. You can't, I think the founders, what they were trying to sort of recognize in so many words was this thing is really important, this religion thing. They were coming out of a milieu, having thrown off the British, where they, and out of the European experience, where they knew about religious war, they knew about religious oppression. A lot of them, their ancestors at that point came to the United States or came to the New World fleeing that. They understood, they knew about the wars, the Protestant Catholic wars, and they understood the wars of the Reformation. They knew that this thing was really powerful, religion, and it shaped people's identities, and people were willing to live for it and die for it, and so on and so forth. They also understood that when the state became involved in inculcating it, that was a source of trouble. They understood that. But they really didn't. So they said, people got to be free to believe. They got to be free to adopt what religions their hearts, minds, and consciences and upbringing sort of led them to follow. But that the government shouldn't be doing anything to tell them what they should or shouldn't believe. Nor should the government excessively or in any way try to identify itself or impose a religion on anybody. But it didn't really say much more than that or how that should be done. They didn't tell us that. They just kind of said those are the general parameters, but they did other things too. They protected freedom of speech. They protected the freedom of the press. They protected due process, right? Later on, like forward to 1868, we also added the Equal Protection Clause, which added another, sort of commandment about how you're supposed to treat people. And we're just sort of left with how to struggle with these things. But we have to struggle with them because that's what our institutions are set up to sort of force us to do. But, and here are some of the, and one of the things I wanted to bring out was some of the reasons why we have to struggle with this. Why we can't just say religion, it can be completely, suppressed, not recognized, not accommodated, whatever. Number one, there's really no freedom of speech without protection for free exercise. Think about it, folks. What's prayer? What are religious ceremonies except symbolic speech or actual speech? I mean, if you're talking, right? I mean, if you're saying your rosary, you're facing Mecca and doing your prayers 5 times a day. That's all speech. It might be about religion, but it's all speech. The Supreme Court has recognized in any number of cases that free exercise and freedom of speech are often inseparable. You can't make a ruling about one without implications for the other. You can't, right? One of the things that the Supreme Court has said is they place the most limits for the government in doing is placing what are referred to as content-based or viewpoint-based restrictions on people's speech. Well, I mean, if you're going to restrict religious speech or any specific religion speech, that's exactly what you're doing, right? And so there's that. The other question is, what are you separating from? What are you not allowed to establish? And also, what is it that you are supposed to allow people to freely exercise? Folks, a lot of people don't know this, but academic scholars of religion do not have a concrete definition of what a religion is, right? As one commentator noted, there's no single characteristic or set of characteristics that all religions have in common that makes them religions, right? You often have to have working definitions just to have some idea of what you're talking about, but very often religion is a little bit like, I don't mean to offend anybody, but a little bit like what one of the justices said pornography was. I know it when I see it. I know a religion when I see it, but folks, there are religions that don't have a God. Buddhism, for one. And actually, you might think this is crazy what I'm about to say, but actually, if you read the book, it would make perfect sense. I know of a book that describes various religions that has Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Taoism, Jainism, and then it also has dialectical materialism. It actually puts them all together. But the funny thing is that actually, if you read it, the way they talk about it, yeah, actually, those, what many of us would refer to as ideological or political beliefs, they work exactly the same way as a religion does. It tells you what's right and wrong. It gives you a worldview. It tells you where things come from, and it tells you where all of us are going. It's just like any other religion, except it doesn't have a God. Although one could argue it's just like any other religion in that it was made up by people. But that's something else you can talk about. Then there's all kinds of historical arguments, right? Like, for example, the people who support a more accommodationist position would say that the framers intended to promote cooperation between government and religion, not neutrality or governmental hostility towards it, right? They argue that because the Establishment Clause forbids Congress to make laws regarding an establishment rather than the establishment of religion, government must not show preference amongst religions or the religious versus the non-religious, right? You can't favor one versus the other. Also, according to accommodationist interpretation, the First Amendment permits government actions that promote religion, but not religious institutions, as long as there's no discrimination against non-religious views or in favor of any one religion. This means that the government can do things like offer students loans to attend religious schools. Like, for example, you can get Pell Grants to go to, or federal student loans to go to BYU or Georgetown or Notre Dame, right? Just like you can get them to come here or to the University of Michigan or Michigan State, which are state schools, and so on and so forth. And also the state can give release time to students. You know, where I moved from, it was very common for students to give release time in the middle of the school day to go have religious instruction, and then they would come back on campus and then have their continue their lessons at the public school. And that is an accommodation. But there's a lot of tough issues, right? There are so many that I'm not going to pretend to have the answer to. For example, state adoption or association with religious practices or ideas. I mean, I can talk about, you mentioned some cases, I can talk about Town of Greece versus Galloway, right? Where some citizens challenged the practice in this town of Greece, New York, of opening all the legislative sessions with Christian prayer, right? Or, for example, American Legion versus the American Humanist Association, where the American Humanist Association challenged the fact that there was a cross that was placed by a private organization on public land as a memorial to soldiers who had fallen, American soldiers who had fallen in World War I, right? That was an interesting one because actually some of the members of the majority in that case actually said that the cross had, in that sense, had kind of lost its religious significance, which I thought was kind of funny. I mean, I wonder what a lot of devout Christians would have thought about that. But they actually said that for these purposes, I mean, it's sort of like, it's a bit like Santa Claus, right? Or a creche. It has lost. You can have that in front of the town hall because it's lost its religious significance. Yeah, okay. And then there's also another issue. Like, for example, a lot of countries that a lot of us would consider ones that respect individual liberty and religious freedom are ones that have official churches. The UK has an official church, right? Many countries provide state support to various churches, like Germany does, and various others, right? But you're allowed to have your religious faith there. The whole issue of free exercise, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. What if your interpretation of your religion means that you should be able to have more than one spouse? Or that you should be able to discriminate against people, for example, not marry interracial couples or not marry same-sex couples. And then, of course, if anybody's allowed to assert that, how is it equal if everybody else has to follow the law unless you say, well, that's my religion, so I don't have to follow that law because that's my religion. All I can say about that is that I think it's pretty clear from the structure of the Constitution we were meant to struggle with these issues. I'm going to be the last person to say that I have an answer to how we're supposed to work that out, but that's what our institutions are for us to work out these answers. We're welcome to the struggle.
Thanks, that's time.
Professor Naus, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. That's, I have, there are a lot of points that I would agree with in that, right? That, and I would just to kind of start off, I want to emphasize something that maybe came out a little bit in Professor McLeod's talk, but that these cases are not necessarily, these challenges to state displays or support for religion are not necessarily brought by an atheist or a person who is adverse. A lot of them are actually brought by religious adherents and often by people who are adherents of the religion that is being displayed, right? And they're like, you took my religious symbol and you have appropriated it, and I don't like seeing the government use in this way. So it's not the case that religious people necessarily agree with government displays of their religious symbols, because sometimes they don't think that's I wanted to talk about the struggle. I love that idea. And so it's sort of the tools that we might have to deal with the struggle, and again, critique where the current court is with that, which I think in a lot of cases we see them repeatedly going back and talking about text, history, and precedent. And those are the things that we look to figure out the meaning of all of these very vague or maybe a more politically correct way of saying open text provisions in the Constitution, right, where we don't really know what these words mean. And so, I mean, I think in my view that the text, we can't, as I said before, I don't think we should be reading the Establishment Clause out of the text. I have a lot of concerns about the court's use of history, in part because when we're looking at, and you heard about the First Amendment, which has, it's, I think, important to mention, it's not just the religion clauses, it's also the free speech clause, and there are other rights in there, and there's a freedom of association that I'm sure also helps religious exercise, right? So there are other components to it. But when we're looking back to 1791, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, and we're focused very myopically on that history to the exclusion of later history. And I actually think that some of the Reconstruction amendments post-Civil War may have, they may have altered the scope of the First Amendment protections. Because when we realized, oh, like the Constitution broke, and then we had a war, and then we get Reconstruction, right? That's a significant shift. But you tend to see this court focus very much on 1791 history. I would just note that a lot of people in this room right now probably would not, like, that's not going to be to our benefit. A lot of us would not have had a vote at all in 1791, right? So you really need to be a property-owning white man in order to have a stake in what was happening in, or in a voice in what was happening in the country. And beyond that, right, it was just there were these different Christian sects was what the founders were dealing with. And today, I think Breyer mentioned this in a recent opinion. He said, we have a nation of more than 330 million people who ascribe to over 100 different religions. And then he went on, in that context, state neutrality with respect to religion is particularly important. And I want to note, I said a little bit about this, but to come back to this idea that, not all of these religions are necessarily getting equal support. So if we think about neutral, or even if we think about accommodation, right, as which religions, and a lot of our, the calendar is set up around certain religions and certain religious holidays and certain religious practices, right? And we have weekends, and we have Sunday closing laws and all of those things. But people don't think of those things. I mean, the court would say, oh, Sunday closing laws, that's not, like the cross, they have now lost this religious component or this religious motivation because people just like a day off, right? And the cross is religious, but it also has these other connotations to it, so it's okay. It seems when you survey a group of cases that the court has decided, that when we look to history as a way of interpreting the vagueness of the religion clauses, certain religions, which tend to be Christian religions, do pretty well, and other religions, I'm not sure they do so well, right? So when people who had, indigenous people were trying to participate in a ceremony in which they were using peyote, they get in trouble. I know it's a neutral and generally applicable law, so it's fine if it incidentally burdens your religion. But then when there's a 30 whatever foot Latin cross that the American Legion versus American Humanist Association case, that's okay. One final thing, I'll end on a point of agreement, which is I do think it's really important to talk about what we mean by the word religion. And it is always shocking to me, and I think to my students every semester when we get to that, the case that we read is not even a constitutional case. And it involves a person claiming religious exercise and succeeding in it, who says, I don't necessarily believe in God, but I'm referencing moral philosophers like Plato and Spinoza and Aristotle, and those are people, and the court says, so long as you have a belief that occupies the same place as a supreme being would for someone who was religious, that's close enough. Now that's an old case. I tend to think that this court would say, the current court, might say, we're looking at history and we see a lot of Christianity, and so those things are okay, as the Latin cross was in the American Legion case. But things that are newer expressions of religion or different religions that the court is not so comfortable with, I have a lot of concern as how they would fare. I'm so sorry. I went over my time. Go ahead.
It's okay. It was excellent. I would simply say that I'm going to defend sort of an accommodationist view or a view like that, but I'm actually going to say it and defend it from a textualist point of view because, two of the predominant points of view that are often espoused by current members of the court are textualism and originalism. Originalism has a lot to do with looking at whatever the justice feels was the intention of the people who drafted or wrote or ratified a certain provision of the Constitution, and trying to figure out how they would have understood the language that they were using and what they were trying to accomplish and all that. I, as somebody who has studied history for a long time and did my honors work in that in undergrad, I would just simply point out that there's how many different biographies of Abraham Lincoln. Everybody's got their own story about history. You can even see the justices dueling about history. I would say that history, to that regard, can be a weak read in terms of persuading anybody. I would just simply say that you don't need to go there. You can just look at the text. They meant to defend something because they put the words free exercise of religion and separation of church and state. Not separation of church and state, establishment of a religion. They actually said that. They actually also talked about freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, and freedom of association. So we don't need to go to history. We can just deal with what we think those commands that are in the document are demanding that we do. And one could also think about, again, the wisdom that might be behind the struggle. Because religion, even though it's really hard to define, it's really important. And I think the framers kind of understood that, and I think it's still pretty evident to people. Again, how do so many people mark the passages of their lives? Funerals, weddings, christenings, baptisms, coming of age. Do you all see what I'm talking about? All that's marked by religion. People get their moral compasses from it, their understanding of the world around them, that basic stuff. It influences their politics. In that regard, for some people, religion is prior to politics. It's even more important than sort of who you vote for, because it informs who you vote for. It informs whether or not you support certain ballot initiatives and all that, because it tells you what's right and wrong. It tells you it helps you make sense of the world around you. And it is also your tie to your community and to the past. Not only the history of your community, but your own family's history. We are defined, for so many of us, by the fact not just that we are maybe Americans or whatever, but by the fact that we're Jews, or we're Muslims, or our family, we're Mormon, we are Chaldean, or something like that. It's totally mixed up, right? I mean, ethnicity, and also anthropologists think religion and ethnicity can they can become each other, right? So the framers all understood that by demanding accommodation of this thing, we were demanding that our state allow for this variance and ferment and discovery and journey for all of us into who we are and to express who we are in a way that, in a certain sense, is prior to whether or not you were a Democrat or a Republican or a, in their day, a Federalist versus a Democratic Republican and so on and so forth. And what they were saying is, hey, state, get out of the way of that. People have to be able to figure this stuff out on their own. That's why there's free exercise clause, and that's why there is the establishment of any kind of a religion is bad. People, stay out of all that. Just stay out. Now, but what does that mean? Does that mean that if most of the people in a certain area are of a certain religious persuasion that they can't have holidays? That they can't say Sunday is the day off, or that you can't have Christmas as a day off? That if you make Christmas a day off, that you have to have you got to have all the days of Ramadan, or you see what I'm saying, or whatever. Like, you got to have all those different days. I don't know that we have to have prayers for everybody or for every different religion, or anybody who wants to have one. I mean, with the state I just left, there were legislators who walked out of the legislative chamber when a Hindu cleric was asked to say the prayer before. They walked out because they thought that was un-American. But I mean, it is true that most people in Idaho are Christian. I mean, is it okay for them to set up their state, and then if the religious majority in Idaho were to change, that maybe you could one day be Muslim or Taoist or whatever? I don't know. I mean, do we have to do that? That's part of the struggle. Yeah, that's part of the struggle. And so again, but the commandment was that we do struggle. We have to struggle with this because it's so important. Thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. Now we have time for about 10 minutes of questions from the audience.
Can I actually?
Sure.
Do you mind if I ask?
Please.
There's a question that I think might be. I'm curious to hear what you think. So I just think this might be a helpful way to kind of kick this off, because I wonder. So a case we have not talked about. I think we've mentioned a whole bunch of different cases. Is Kennedy versus Bremerton. I don't think the Coach Kennedy at the 50-yard, crying at the 50-yard line on the football field. You may have heard about this in the news. I guess I just wanted to know from an accommodation perspective. So, because the way I teach this too has these three different, there's strict separation, there's neutrality, there's accommodation. Those are kind of the viewpoints. And we are really in the accommodation viewpoint now with the court. What do you think? Like, what is the effect of the court basically accommodating Coach Kennedy? So that, how do you see that case? Because my concern with that case is that who is visible and who is invisible, right? If he is visible and as the victim, and then the students who might be non-adherents are rendered invisible. But maybe you could see that as an accommodation case. I just wonder how you.
I can give you an argument for. I can give you an argument. The argument would go something like this: that the coach. And folks, this was a coach at a public school who was doing a prayer. It was after a game, wasn't it? Or was it before? Yeah. That first of all is an expression of his religious faith, and that he did not command any student to join him, nor did he punish any student or ridicule any student who refused. So then, therefore, there was no sanction from him in his official, or even as far as I know, even in personal capacity for any student who chose not to join him in his expression of faith. He did not in any way discriminate against students who did not share his faith. He just simply felt that it was important for him to show his faith at that particular point in time. So one could argue that there was no coercion for any student who did not share his faith. There was no ridicule, there was no backlash, there was nothing. It just letting him show his faith, and perhaps other students as well. I can tell you that public university that I just left, that was a common thing that students would go run and pray at the beginning of the game. That there was no establishment there because there was no sanction against anybody who refused or who disagreed, and no command that anyone join him, and that was just allowing him to show his faith at that moment. That was very important to him, and so that was about his personal freedom. That would be one argument that one could, granting that I totally understand counter-argument.
Am I correct? The Supreme Court last year said that coaches can engage in that type of prayer at public school with their athletes as long as it's non-coercive. Is that fair?
That was my understanding of that was my understanding of the whole thing. Yeah.
So I think they've held the line on you can't coerce people, but I find it remarkable that they did not find that coercive, right? So I think that, again, we get into a debate about what counts as coercion, because when you look historically at the court's cases in public schools, especially K-12 schools, the court has been very cognizant that the peer pressure, the desire to please teachers, all of the things that operate on students at that age who are mandated to be at school, it's not their choice, means that the court has been very sensitive to establishment. Like the legislature, the court is always, can start with a prayer, right? And Marsh v. Chambers, I think is but schools, the court has seen very differently. No prayers at graduate, or they've had these rules. And then all of that kind of, to me, I mean, you could read the case differently, right? But to me, kind of came crashing down last term when they said, oh, this doesn't count as coercion. No one's being pressured. Maybe they won't get to play as much if they're not standing with him, but how are you going to really know? Maybe it's subconscious. Maybe we have unconscious biases, right? I don't know if anyone's ever.
I would also just add that from one thing I've heard from students is that it's not the faculty or the staff that actually creates the most coercion, it's the other students. So, I mean, it's not that, that a teacher is going to come up and say, oh, you didn't join us in the prayer, you're a bad person. It's not that the teacher would do that. It's that other students would say, how come you weren't standing? Blah, 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 blah. That's real. I'm not sure why the court changed its mind. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know. I mean, maybe they're seeing something different now than they saw, however many, 60, 70 years ago. I don't know. But it looks like they have.
Are there any questions from the audience for one or both of our speakers? Please go. I saw a student in the back. Please.
You have repeatedly mentioned that there's going to be this struggle with the Constitution, that expected struggle. Do you ever foresee that there's going to be a balance found, or that it'll eventually even out and the struggle will end, or is this going to be a constant struggle through the course of America?
I don't see how any struggle over something that's as important as this will ever end. But because I think that one of the few constants in life is change. As we just learned about abortion rights, no argument is ever settled. It's never settled. As long as anybody wants to keep talking about it, debating it, making it an issue, it never gets settled. Same was true with slavery in the 19th century. Nothing ever gets settled unless people stop talking about it. But that might only be a temporary thing. And what was controversial at one point ceases to be. What was not at one point becomes so. In my lifetime, LGBT rights. When I was a kid, that wasn't that big of an issue that many people were paying attention to. 2015, you get Obergefell versus Hodges. So I'm just saying that I don't think that these things will ever go away. But one of the arguments that I would make about why America has been as successful as it has been as a construct is because our institutions so far have been robust to the conflict and to managing it such that they don't fall apart and such that the country has not permanently fallen apart, while recognizing that these struggles will continue and probably won't ever stop.
Professor Nellis.
I'll just quickly add, I think that's a great question. The way I kind of think about it in terms of the courts, what's happened with the court is basically like a pendulum, and it kind of swings one way and then it swings the other way, and sometimes it overcorrects in one direction. And so I guess what I see happening right now is that so if you think of it as these kind of a spectrum of views, but with strict separation of church and state at one end, neutrality in the middle, accommodation on the other end. To me, we're pretty far on the accommodation side right now. And that's quite different than where we were, I would say, for most of the past 50 years, I would think of us as being kind of in the middle. I don't know if you have a different view of that, but that's, so if we tend to kind of go back and forth, and it's just based, I don't see it as being either. That's part of the, yeah.
Another question? Please.
So when we're talking about the struggle, I know you said it can be managed, but what kind of things can be done to make the struggle easier, manageable but easier?
Institutionally, or, I mean, I don't, well, first of all, one could argue it's not supposed to be easy. I mean, it's supposed to be a struggle. One would hope that it does not involve violence, right? One would hope that it does not involve marginalization, excessive marginalization of communities, or their destruction or their dehumanization. But self-governance is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it just doesn't. You need to be in the struggle constantly. So what I tell students is that you shouldn't ever think that any argument is settled, because it never is. If you care about it, you need to be in there fighting, or advocating. One could always talk about hope that we would have and would not celebrate political leaders that appeal to our worst instincts and try to tear down our institutions by pushing them excessively or violating norms too much. But those people get in there because they have support. So
That's announced.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think, yeah, everyone getting involved is important. I think robust voting rights are important, so everyone has a voice and people can engage in civic discourse and exercise their voice. The violence piece, I share that. This is one of the first kind of big in-person post-pandemic debate that I've done. I've done talks, but and I always wonder, I mean, I didn't used to think so much about violence when I was agreeing to do stuff, but now I do. I mean, it feels like in the past few years, the environment has very much shifted in a direction that, I worry about, because it does not, yes, I agree, self-governance is not for the faint of heart, but I can see over the course of my career different sets of concerns about having these kinds of conversations in certain settings.
Well, regretfully, our time has expired. Many students have class at 1, but please join me in thanking our speakers.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Getty.
Thank you. Thanks for attending. I didn't just today.
Someday I can't believe you know that much. That was fine. I prefer to think of us not as debaters, but more as presenters.
Yeah, I like the idea of academic. I'm going to ask him if I should stop those screens, probably. I mean, I could just hit the.
I think you did. That's fine.
Thank you very much.
I'm
Yeah,
just
gotta
saying
check
that,
the
by the way.
history.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies here. So, yeah.
As long as they're AC.
This was wonderful. I loved just the interaction between the two.
Yeah, it was really great.
Great job.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure.
I had never been here. I heard about it. But
Thank you very much for your help today.
Well, I'm glad Professor Gedden is
Otherwise, you don't produce
together.
Right. Then they would have to move it.
Thank you so much.
You want to get it?
Yes.
What graduate programs do you have here?
We have 10 programs.
End Street.
We have a master resident but an MED program. We have a